The streets of Tehran are ablaze tonight, not with celebration, but with rage. And the Iranian state has answered that rage with bullets and heavy artillery. What we're witnessing isn't simply civil unrest or isolated demonstrations. This is a systemic crisis years in the making, rooted in the very architecture of how power operates in the Islamic Republic. When a government deploys state-armed militias, not regular police, but ideologically loyal paramilitaries, to fire heavy weapons on its own citizens, we're seeing the final stage of a ruling structure that has lost legitimacy and can only maintain control through raw, unfiltered violence. The economic collapse, the corruption of the clerical elite, the suffocating moral police apparatus, and the generational divide between Iran's youth and its gerontocratic leadership have all converged into this explosive moment. But here's what the mainstream media won't tell you. This isn't about freedom versus tyranny in some abstract sense. This is about a failing capitalist theocratic hybrid system that enriched a tiny elite while condemning millions to poverty, inflation, and hopelessness. The militias firing tonight aren't defending Iran. They're defending their own economic interests, their own power, their own survival. And the world is watching to see whether the Iranian people can break through. Let me be very clear about what's happening in Iran right now. Because if you're getting your information from the standard Western media outlets, you're probably hearing a very selective narrative, one that serves specific geopolitical interests rather than giving you the complete picture. When we see state-armed militias firing heavy weapons into crowds of protesters in Tehran, we need to understand this as more than just authoritarian repression. We need to see it as the inevitable outcome of a particular kind of political economy, a system that has been cracking under its own contradictions for decades now. And what we're watching is not the beginning of this crisis, but rather one of its most visible eruptions. The Islamic Republic of Iran operates under what we might call a dual power structure. You have the elected government on one side, with presidents and parliaments and all the trappings of democracy, and then you have the real power structure, the unelected clerical establishment centered around the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guard Corps. This isn't just a peculiarity of Iranian politics. This is a deliberate system designed to ensure that no matter who the people vote for, ultimate power remains in the hands of a very specific elite. And that elite isn't just religious, it's economic. The Revolutionary Guard, which controls these militias we're seeing on the streets, doesn't just run security operations. They control vast sectors of the Iranian economy: construction, telecommunications, oil and gas, import-export operations. We're talking about an economic empire worth tens of billions of dollars, maybe more because the accounting is deliberately opaque. So when you see these militias firing on protesters, understand that they're not just defending an ideology or a religious system. They're defending their economic interests. They're defending their control over the wealth of the nation. The young people in the streets of Tehran, many of them women who have been at the forefront of these protests, they're not just protesting hijab laws or moral policing, though those are the sparks that ignite the flames. They're protesting a system that has stolen their future, that has enriched a tiny clerical and military elite while subjecting the vast majority of Iranians to crushing inflation, unemployment, and economic hopelessness. The Iranian rial has collapsed. Basic goods are increasingly unaffordable. University graduates, people with degrees and skills, cannot find work that pays a living wage. Meanwhile, the children of the elite, the sons and daughters of Revolutionary Guard commanders and senior clerics, they're living in luxury, studying abroad, driving expensive cars, completely insulated from the economic devastation their parents' system has created. This is the pattern we see repeated throughout history, and it's the pattern that Richard Wolff has spent his entire career analyzing. When a ruling class becomes so divorced from the needs and realities of the population, when they construct systems that funnel wealth upward and concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands, eventually the contradictions become unbearable. The system cannot sustain itself through consent anymore, so it must sustain itself through force. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Tehran right now. The militias, the heavy weapons, the brutal crackdowns, these are not signs of strength. These are signs of profound weakness, signs that the ruling structure knows it has lost the hearts and minds of the people and can only maintain control through violence. Now let's talk about the international dimension of this. Because Iran doesn't exist in a vacuum. The Islamic Republic has been under various forms of economic sanctions for over 4 decades. Sanctions that have been weaponized by the United States and its allies as a tool of foreign policy. And here's where the analysis gets complicated, because we need to hold two truths simultaneously. First, the economic suffering of ordinary Iranians has been massively exacerbated by these sanctions. When you cut a country off from international banking systems, when you prevent them from selling their oil freely on world markets, when you make it nearly impossible for them to import essential goods, including medical supplies, you are inflicting collective punishment on an entire population. The sanctions haven't weakened the Revolutionary Guard. If anything, they've strengthened it, because sanctions create black markets and smuggling operations, and guess who controls those? The very military and security apparatus that the sanctions were supposedly designed to pressure. But second, and this is equally important, we cannot let the Iranian regime off the hook by blaming everything on external pressure. The corruption, the mismanagement, the deliberate concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a clerical elite, these are internal choices made by the people who run this system. The Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard could have chosen to distribute Iran's oil wealth more equitably. They could have chosen to invest in productive infrastructure, in education, in healthcare, in creating opportunities for young people. Instead, they've chosen to funnel that wealth into their own pockets, into foreign military adventures in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, into nuclear programs and missile development, while letting the domestic economy rot from within. And here's what makes this moment so dangerous and so unpredictable. The Iranian regime is facing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Internally, you have this massive youth protest movement that keeps erupting despite brutal crackdowns. You have workers going on strike, teachers demanding unpaid wages, entire sectors of the economy where people have simply stopped believing the government's promises. Externally, you have the ongoing tensions with Israel, the complex relationship with Russia and China, the proxy conflicts across the Middle East, and the ever-present threat of military confrontation with the United States. When a government is under this much pressure from this many directions, it becomes increasingly paranoid, increasingly violent, increasingly willing to do whatever it takes to maintain control. The women-led protests that began after the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody, they represented something profound. A rejection not just of compulsory hijab, but of the entire patriarchal, authoritarian structure that the hijab symbolizes in the Iranian context, and the regime understood this, which is why they responded with such ferocity. This wasn't about modesty or religious values. This was about power and control. The moment women successfully resist the state's control over their bodies and their choices, the entire legitimacy of the system comes into question. If the state cannot enforce these basic rules, what does that say about its authority more broadly? What we're seeing now, with the deployment of heavy weapons against protesters, is an escalation that tells us the regime is genuinely frightened. They're not using riot police with batons and tear gas anymore. They're using weapons of war against their own population. That's a line that, once crossed, is very difficult to uncross. It radicalizes the population further. It makes compromise and de-escalation much more difficult. It pushes the conflict toward a point where only two outcomes seem possible. Either the regime crushes the resistance completely through overwhelming force, or the resistance grows strong enough to challenge the regime's hold on power. We're not there yet, but every escalation moves us closer to that binary choice. Now, I want you to think about this in the broader context of what's happening globally, because Iran is not unique. Around the world, we're seeing similar patterns. Entrenched elites using violence to maintain power in the face of popular discontent, driven by economic inequality and lack of opportunity. We see it in different forms and different contexts, but the underlying dynamic is remarkably similar. When economic systems are designed to enrich those at the top while everyone else struggles, eventually people say enough. They go into the streets. They demand change. And then the question becomes whether those in power will respond with reform or with repression. In Iran, we know which choice they've made. The role of social media and technology in these protests cannot be ignored either. Despite the government's attempts to shut down the internet, to block messaging apps, to prevent images and videos from getting out, the information still flows. Young Iranians are tech-savvy. They use VPNs, encrypted messaging, satellite internet connections. The world sees what's happening in Tehran in real time, and that creates a different dynamic than in previous eras when authoritarian regimes could crack down in darkness and silence. Now the whole world watches, and while that doesn't stop the bullets, it does create international pressure. It does make it harder for the regime to control the narrative, and it does inspire the protesters by showing them that their struggle is seen and recognized globally. But let's be honest about the limits of international solidarity. The protesters in Tehran are on their own in the ways that matter most. No foreign military is coming to save them. No Western government is going to risk war with Iran to support these protests. Economic sanctions will continue, which will hurt ordinary Iranians more than the elite. Statements of support from Western politicians ring hollow when those same politicians have spent decades implementing policies that contributed to Iran's isolation and economic suffering. The Iranian people know this. They're not naive. They're not looking for white knights from Washington or Paris or London. They're fighting for themselves, for their own futures, and they know that whatever change comes will have to come from within. The historical parallels are worth considering. We've seen revolutionary moments before where it seemed like entrenched regimes were invincible, and then suddenly they weren't. The Shah's regime in Iran itself collapsed in 1979 despite having one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East and the full backing of the United States. The Soviet Union dissolved despite having nuclear weapons and a massive security apparatus. These things can happen. But we've also seen brutal crackdowns succeed, protests crushed, movements scattered and demoralized. Syria is right next door. We all saw what happened there when a government decided to use unlimited force against its own population. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on the balance of forces, on the unity and determination of the resistance, on the willingness of key institutions like the regular army to remain loyal to the regime or defect to the people, on external factors that can strengthen one side or the other. What makes the Iranian situation particularly complex is the religious dimension. This isn't just a secular authoritarian regime. It's a theocracy that claims divine legitimacy for its rule. The supreme leader isn't just a political figure. He's supposed to be God's representative on earth according to the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Challenging the government is framed as challenging God, as apostasy, as attacking Islam itself. That's a powerful tool for delegitimizing opposition and justifying extreme violence against protesters. But it's also a vulnerability, because when people stop believing in that divine legitimacy, when they see the corruption and hypocrisy of the clerical elite, the entire ideological foundation crumbles. And we're seeing evidence that for many young Iranians, especially in urban areas, that foundation has already crumbled. They don't buy it anymore. They see a group of old men using religion to justify their power and their wealth, and they're done with it. The economic dimension cannot be separated from any of this. Iran should be a wealthy country. They have massive oil and gas reserves, a highly educated population, strategic geographic position, rich cultural heritage, everything necessary for prosperity. Instead, ordinary people struggle while the elite live in obscene luxury. That's not an accident. That's not because of sanctions alone, though sanctions make it worse. That's because of how the economy is structured, who controls the resources, who makes the decisions about how wealth is distributed. The Revolutionary Guard's economic empire operates with no transparency, no accountability, massive corruption. Oil revenues that should benefit all Iranians instead disappear into a black hole of unaudited military and security expenditures and private enrichment. This is exactly the kind of economic structure that creates revolutionary pressure, because people can see with their own eyes the gap between what their country could provide and what they actually receive. The international community's response has been predictably inadequate and hypocritical. Western governments issue statements supporting the protesters while maintaining sanctions that hurt those same protesters. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE watch with interest, hoping to see their rival Iran weakened, but offering no substantive support to the Iranian people. Russia and China, Iran's ostensible partners, have no interest in seeing the regime fall, but also no great desire to be associated too closely with brutal crackdowns on civilians. Everyone calculates their position based on narrow self-interest rather than principle, and the protesters in Tehran understand this perfectly well. They know they're not part of anyone's humanitarian concern. Their piece is on a geopolitical chessboard, and all the major powers are making their moves based on strategic calculations that have nothing to do with Iranian freedom or dignity or justice. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Will these protests continue to grow until they reach a critical mass where even heavy weapons cannot suppress them? Will the regime succeed in crushing the resistance through sheer brutality and terror? Will some faction within the ruling elite decide that reform is necessary to preserve the system and push out the hardliners? Will external events, war with Israel, economic collapse, leadership succession, create new openings for change? Nobody knows. History is contingent. It's made by human choices and actions, not by inevitable forces. The outcome will depend on what millions of individual Iranians decide to do in the coming days and weeks and months, whether they keep going into the streets despite the danger, whether soldiers and police continue following orders to shoot, whether the various opposition groups can unite around a common vision, whether the international situation helps or hurts their cause. What we can say with certainty is that the current system is unsustainable. You cannot govern indefinitely through force alone. You cannot maintain legitimacy when you're firing heavy weapons at your own young people. You cannot build a stable society when corruption and inequality are this extreme. Something will give. The question is what form that change will take, how much suffering will happen before it arrives, and whether what comes after will be better or worse than what exists now. Those are questions only the Iranian people can answer, and they'll answer them with their choices and their courage in the face of state violence that seems designed to break their will but somehow has not.